Thank you, Madam Speaker. I can indicate that a vote will be required today.
Thank you.
Madam Speaker, we are moving to ensure that we are moving to ensure that conservation covenants in Tasmania receive the protection in perpetuity, which we believe most Tasmanians would understand them to already have. But of course, as we've discovered in recent times, Madam Speaker, there are question marks over those protections that now sit over conservation covenants in Tasmania. So, Madam Speaker, conservation covenants are established under the Nature Conservation Act of 2002. They are a legally binding agreement between landowners and the Crown, who is represented by the Minister for the Environment. They make a critical contribution, Madam Speaker, to the protection of natural values, ecosystem services and to biodiversity. There are in Tasmania 890 covenants on private land that cover an area of about 111,000 hectares. And late last week we visited Peter Tuft, who is a landowner at Kettering, who has one of simply the most beautiful properties I've ever seen in Tasmania, up on the hill, looking over Storm Bay, Bruny Island. You can see all the way down to the Tasman Peninsula. And at the foot of Peter Tuft's property is this beautiful patch of intact forest, and there is a conservation covenant on the Tufts property. But of course, a question now hangs over the protected status of his covenanted property, as well as the other 889 conservation covenants in Tasmania. And this has come around, Madam Speaker, as a result of changes to the Tasmanian planning system, which have seen under interim planning schedules conservation covenants zoned as rural resource, Madam Speaker. But now, of course, each municipality is going through a formalised rezoning process, and those conservation covenants are by default being declared rural, Madam Speaker. And the issue here is that that zoning would allow for extractive industries on covenanted land, including forestry and mining. We need to make sure that the guidance provided by the Tasmanian Planning Commission in its guidelines on state planning provisions is adhered to as part of this rezoning process. And the Planning Commission has made it clear that the most appropriate zoning for covenanted land is landscape conservation zoning, Madam Speaker, and this would ensure that there are no extractive industries, that is, logging and mining, on land which should be protected in perpetuity. Madam Speaker, one of the problems that we have here, though, Madam Speaker, is the Department of State Growth. The Department of State Growth wrote to the Tasmanian Planning Commission and the Chair, Mr John Ramsey, on the 20th of December last year, expressing a very strong view about what zoning should be applied to conservation covenants in Tasmania. It is the Department's view that covenanted land, which we can think of in many ways, Madam Speaker, as having national park protections on private land, the Department's view is that those covenanted areas should be available in future for potential extractive industries, including forestry and mining, and the Department of State Growth, presumably on the part of government, was lobbying the Tasmanian Planning Commission to ensure that covenanted land was zoned rural use, which means that it would be available potentially in future for extractive industries. And the letter that the Department of State Growth wrote to the Planning Commission really is something, Madam Speaker. It is internally contradictory, but it is also dangerous in that it suggests that all those protections which are over covenanted land can be thrown out the window if there's some extractive industry that wishes to take place on an area of covenanted land. One of the most disturbing paragraphs is this one. State growth is concerned that the application of the landscape conservation zone in this manner could have a sterilising effect on rural land, well beyond the land parcels to be rezoned, which has the potential to limit future resource use and development. Well, yes, Madam Speaker, exactly. That's why you establish a conservation covenant over a particularly special area of land in order to limit what can happen on that land in future to protect the values which underpinned the covenant, Madam Speaker. And we go to the two internally contradictory statements in this letter. One says here, the more sensitive uses there are across the rural landscape, the more difficult it is for extractive industries which are considered appropriate in this environment to gain approval. If the landscape conservation zone was to apply as proposed by the Section 35F report, there is greater potential for a sterilising effect. And then it goes on, while it is understood there may be merit in protecting some land parcels from resource extraction activities, conservation covenants have traditionally been used for this purpose. Covenants provide appropriate protections without the need for different zoning that may inadvertently exclude other activities into the future. The application of the landscape conservation zone over land that is already the subject of a conservation covenant does not provide any additional protections. Well, Madam Speaker, this is a government agency contradicting itself in its advice to the Tasmanian Planning Commission, because if the landscape conservation zoning didn't provide additional protections from extractive industries, why is the department so opposed to it? It's very clear that the 890 conservation covenanted parcels of land in Tasmania should have the strongest possible protections, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Dr. Woodruff. So there is an organisation that is working to represent covenant holders in Tasmania, Conservation Landholders Tasmania, which has been contacting covenant landowners to inform them about the rezoning of their property to rural or agriculture and encouraging them to request rezoning to landscape conservation during their local draft planning provisions exhibition period. So the problem that we have here in terms of, there's a big problem when you've got a government department trying to undermine protections for covenanted land. But the other issue here is that the Crown, and in this case the Minister for the Environment, has made no attempt, Madam Speaker, to contact covenant holders in Tasmania. And remember, a covenant is a legally binding agreement between the landowner and the Minister for the Environment, who is a party to that legally binding agreement. But the Minister for the Environment, who is wholly conflicted on this matter because he is also the Minister for Planning, has made no endeavours whatsoever to engage with covenant holders on the issue of zoning as we move through these planning system changes, Madam Speaker. So when preparing their draft local provision schedules, planning authorities are mostly rezoning these areas as rural and agricultural, and covenant holders have been finding out about it through notices in the newspaper. And that's it, other than the work now of Conservation Landholders Tasmania, Madam Speaker. So we are very concerned that this is an attempt to weaken the protections around covenanted land by stealth. The Planning Commission has been very clear that the most appropriate zone for properties with conservation covenants is landscape conservation. We should be making sure, Madam Speaker, that in a time of significant biodiversity decline, those remarkable and very diverse areas of Tasmania that are protected by covenants are truly protected in perpetuity. And we raised this issue at one point in the debate with the Minister for Environment and Planning earlier this year, and he got that far off look in his eyes, as if he didn't know what we were talking about. Madam Speaker, the Minister for the Environment and Planning knows exactly what we were talking about at that time, and he knows now that it is a serious concern. When you've got a government agency undermining the advice put forward in guideline number 1 by the Tasmanian Planning Commission in order to make available potentially 111,000 hectares of Tasmania for extractive industries, for logging and for mining, Madam Speaker. And the notion that these extractive industries should always have preeminence over any other land use, and particularly over the protection of areas of land, is offensive, ridiculous, and is potentially very destructive, Madam Speaker. So hopefully the Minister will respond during this debate, and he can explain what the motive is here for weakening the protections of covenanted land, what he sees his legal responsibilities are as a co-signatory to these covenants, and how he can explain to covenant holders why he has completely left them in the lurch, Madam Speaker, because the conflict that the Minister has here is manifest, and it is corrupting a process of rezoning covenanted lands. The Minister who represents the Crown as the legally bound co-signatory to a covenant, that is the Minister for Planning, Minister for the Environment, is also the Minister for Planning, who is overseeing effectively an attempt to weaken the protections on covenanted land, Madam Speaker. And another very concerning aspect of all of this is that the process of negotiating covenants and agreeing covenants has all but stopped, Madam Speaker. The Private Land Conservation Program, which was under DPIPWI, was established in 2006, and this is information from their website, to provide a single point of management for all of the department's conservation programs that focus on private land. The program works with landowners to sustainably manage and conserve natural values, that is native flora and fauna, natural wetlands, geoconservation areas on private land. Now, the department goes on to say, and I do wonder if the Minister reads any of these things, capable land stewardship conserves the natural environment, providing benefits for future Tasmanians and visitors, while enabling landowners to maintain market access and capitalise on new opportunities. The Department's Land Conservation Program seeks to achieve high-level recognition of the biodiversity value of natural systems and the need to appropriately protect them, and to support individuals who voluntarily manage these systems for conservation outcomes. But the bad news, Madam Speaker, is that the Protected Areas on Private Land program has been the principal long-term covenanting program, but currently is not accepting new applications. Instead, the PLCP staff are compiling a list of inquiries for future assessment. Our focus is supporting current covenant owners and land for wildlife members. Well, that is an interesting statement, and I wonder how many staff there are left in the Private Land Conservation Program, Madam Speaker, because the covenant holders that we've engaged with or heard from have not been told about this attempt to change the zoning and weaken the protections on covenanted land. So an agency that was working with landowners to establish conservation covenants is now no longer taking applications from private landowners, as far as we know, and according to their own website. But this is a accumulation of underfunding and under-resourcing of this area of government to the detriment of the protection of natural values, because the non-forest vegetation project has now closed. The Forest Conservation Fund has now closed. The Private Forest Reserves Program has now closed. And the Protected Areas on Private Land Program is not currently accepting new applications for covenants. Now, Madam Speaker, Dr Woodruff and I have been in here long enough to get used to this government's constant undervaluing of natural systems and prioritisation of development and resource extraction in those parts of Tasmania which are unique and special and contribute towards biodiversity. But this is a new low, Madam Speaker, because it's been done in such an underhand way. And I think the Minister owes covenant holders in Tasmania not only an explanation, but an apology. It is unacceptable to be the representative of the Crown who's the signatory to covenants, and I'm not saying Mr Yench's signature is on those covenant agreements because he's been the Minister for a relatively short period of time, but he is the representative of the Crown in terms of these legally binding agreements. And these 890 landholders in Tasmania haven't heard a word from him. And not only that, he, as part of government, has overseen a rezoning process which will weaken protections, but is also no longer accepting covenant applications. Now, I think many Tasmanians would be mortified to know that those areas which they understood to be protected in perpetuity are not potentially protected, and if the government, through its Department of State Growth, gets its way, will be open to logging and mining. And I think they'd be really concerned to hear that this government has stopped entering into covenant agreements with private landowners. Madam Speaker, that is confronting, and it points to a real lack of appreciation for what the protection of natural values is all about, a real contempt for the natural environment and a deep-seated philosophical belief that every part of Tasmania, possibly bar the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area and Parks, but remember initially when the Hodgman government first came to office, they did want to allow logging and mining in the World Heritage Area. But there's this belief in government that every part of Tasmania should be available to make coin from, that every part of Tasmania should be open to potential future resource extraction. Madam Speaker, places like Peter Tuft's little patch of forest at Kettering are unique in the world. This is a beautiful little forest with some big old eucalypts on it. It will be a haven for native species. The day that we were there, during the day, there were wallabies just near the forest grazing, yellow-tailed black cockatoos flew overhead. This is a special place, and all over Tasmania there are these special places that are effectively, or they should be, like national parks on private land. Madam Speaker, we're just the custodians of this beautiful island. That's all we are. We don't own any part of it, not really. Our job as parliamentarians or as ministers, as the case may be, surely is to leave the place in better shape than when we arrived. But not this government, Madam Speaker, not this government. And that's heartbreaking. I'll just digress briefly to talk about the logging coup we went up to last Thursday in the Denison Valley behind Geeveston. You know, the Minister for Resources tells us that Forestry Tasmania doesn't log giant trees. There was a massive Eucalyptus obliqua, a swamp gum, and its girth was at one point about 4.5 metres and at another point of its sawn-off trunk around 5 metres. The tree itself was enormous, and in fact so big, Madam Speaker, that it was felled. 3 attempts were made, you could tell from the cuts on the wood, to chop it into pieces, but it was too big, so it was left on the ground to burn. And in that single example, Madam Speaker, we understand everything we need to know about this government's attitude to the natural environment. A massive, old habitat tree felled and left to burn. What a tragic waste. But it is emblematic of the same philosophy that allows a government to strip away through a rezoning process those protections in perpetuity which must sit over covenanted land, Madam Speaker. They must. And it is damning of this government and this minister who's talking out 2 sides of his face on this issue to, with one fell stroke through the planning system changes, strip away protections on covenanted land. We won't let it stand, Madam Speaker. We will work with Conservation Landholders Tasmania to try to make sure that those protections are strengthened, not weakened, Madam Speaker. And I'll just, I have a letter here from Tasmanian creators, Peter Timms and Robert Desai, who wrote in May this year, concerned about the weakening of protections on covenanted land, to Minister Jentzsch, wrote to him in his capacity as Minister for the Environment and Parks. Perhaps they should have written to him in his capacity as the Minister for Planning. Concerned about what the changes to the planning system would mean for their little patch of covenanted land. And they say this: as the owner of land on the East Coast, which is covered by a conservation covenant, we're very disturbed to have received correspondence from Mr Mick Purvis, Planning Officer with the Glamorgan Spring Bay Council, which appears to throw into doubt the validity of conservation covenants in this state. We are hoping you'll be able to clarify this matter both for us and for all other covenant holders. Briefly, a letter dated 27 April from Conservation Landholders Tasmania informed us that changes to the Tasmanian planning scheme have resulted in conservation properties being rezoned as rural and agricultural. Our land near Orford has been rezoned by the council as agricultural without our knowledge or consent. As we understand it, this leaves our land vulnerable to future agriculture, grazing and forestry. And Mr Purvis told us that, quote, conservation covenant landowners were not contacted by council and invited to participate in the public exhibition period. Planning schemes operate with 2 basic functions. Land use is governed by zones, in your case, rural resource zone. This was a result of a range of matters that are set out in the state planning provisions and guideline number 1. Biodiversity issues, such as you mentioned, are principally managed through the Waterway and Coastal Protection and Priority Vegetation Overlays under the Natural Assets Code. The rural zone was supported for your property due to the structure of these provisions, as they must be used under the state planning provisions and consistent with advice under guideline number 1. Well, Madam Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, it's not consistent with advice under guideline number 1 issued by the Tasmanian Planning Commission. The Tasmanian Planning Commission made it clear that the most appropriate zoning for areas of land that are all or partially covered by conservation covenants and not suitable for agricultural use should be zoned landscape conservation. Now, I understand that Labor may be proposing an amendment to our motion. I'm not sure. There's been no communication from Labor to us. Oh, well, if there's no amendment being proposed, I gather that Labor will be voting against this. That's quite dispiriting for the conservation covenant holders in Tasmania, but to be honest, completely unsurprising. Well, my understanding was that there was a concern expressed by Ms Dow that potentially our notice of motion was a bit too broad brush, and a concern that it may exclude agricultural uses on some covenanted land. And we'd have been very happy to talk to you, Ms Dow, about making some adjustment to our motion so the effect was to ensure that most covenanted land areas were zoned landscape conservation zone, and there was a provision made for covenants over land or part covenants over land where there were agricultural uses. But given Labor's inability to work constructively with the Greens or anyone else in this House, actually, Madam Speaker, it doesn't appear like there's going to be any adjustments to get the right outcome for covenant holders in Tasmania. Madam Speaker, it's just breathtaking. I ask myself on a sitting day basis daily, why are they even here? Madam Speaker, it's so true. Stakeholders engage with Labor in good faith, hoping that there'll be some outcome for them, but because of the resistance to working constructively with the Greens, it would appear that Labor in this place again will let down stakeholders. But I'm sure that Ms Dow said all the right things to the stakeholder, I'm sure. So, Madam Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll just go back to the original motion briefly. We think that the House should vote to support landscape conservation zoning over areas of land that were set aside for conservation purposes. We actually just think that's the decent thing to do, Mr Deputy Speaker, but given that the Minister for Planning, who will stand up soon, is working with the Department of State Growth to make sure that the protections on covenanted land are being weakened, I don't know that that is going to happen. But I think it's worth saying, just in closing, each established conservation covenant is a legally binding agreement between a private landholder and the Crown. And it is a fact that those legally binding agreements place much stronger obligations on the private landowner than they do on government. And now we understand that government is undermining those legally binding agreements through a rezoning process. Conservation covenants, Mr Deputy Speaker, are an important part of the National Reserve estate. It is how we achieve protections on private land and assist private landholders to look after their little patch of Tasmania, Mr Deputy Speaker. And this whole Parliament should be working constructively to help private landowners look after their covenanted areas of land, Mr Deputy Speaker. That is the only decent way to respond to this issue, Mr Deputy Speaker. So we call on the Minister for Planning, who is also the Environment Minister, to issue a planning directive to ensure covenanted land is protected from resource extraction through landscape conservation zoning across all municipalities, Mr Deputy Speaker. And there is still half an hour to go before we call a vote on this notice of motion, and I hope members on both sides of the House take this opportunity to reflect on their responsibility to the people of Tasmania and their ethical responsibility to leave this place in a better state than it was when we arrived, Mr Deputy Speaker. That's a responsibility Dr Woodruff and I take extremely seriously, as is evidenced by the matters we bring forward to this House and indeed the way we vote, because we have the courage of our convictions and our values, Mr Deputy Speaker, which is a lot more, regrettably, than I can say for some of my colleagues.